Welcome. For those who don't know, I'm Darlene McLennan, and I'm the manager of the Australian Disability Clearinghouse on Education and Training, ADCET for short. This webinar is being live captioned. To activate those captions, you can click on the CC button in the toolbar that is located either at the top or at the bottom of your screen. We also have the captions via a browser, and we'll put that link into the chat now for you to access. I'm coming to you from Lutchewita, Tasmanian Aboriginal land, and in the spirit of reconciliation, I want to respectfully acknowledge the Lutchewita nations and also recognise the Aboriginal history and culture of the land, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and to the many Aboriginal people that did not make elder status. I also want to acknowledge all the countries participating in this meeting, and also acknowledge their elders and ancestors and their legacy to us, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar today. Feel free to acknowledge the countries you are on in our chat. Okay, today's webinar, Managing Complex and Challenging Mental Health Situations, is being presented by Brandon Taylor. Brandon is the Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy Manager for TAFE Queensland. Brandon has presented for us on a number of topics. He's an engaging and inspiring speaker. This topic has certainly hit a niche, or not a niche, hit the mark. I think in that we've had over 700 people register for this webinar, which is absolutely fabulous, but also shows that there is a need for out there in the sector around understanding people's mental health conditions and how we can better support students with mental health conditions to succeed in tertiary education. Before I begin and hand over to Brandon, just a couple of more housekeeping details. We're recording this webinar and it will be put up on ADCET in the coming days. As I said at the beginning, this webinar is being captioned by Bradley, and that's by Bradley reporting Donna. If you have any technical difficulties, you can email us at admin@adcet.edu.au. The presentation will go for around 45 to 50 minutes. Brandon has said that there is some time for some questions. We encourage you all to put the questions into the Q&A box, not the chat. So the chat's there for everybody, so we can actually have a conversation as we go along. But if you actually want to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A box. We have also allowed the up button, so you can actually press on a question that you like or want answered, and that puts it up high for me, so I can actually go and find that question easily, so it doesn't get quite overwhelmed. We'll also be tweeting today. We're trying to get more engagement in our Twitter sphere, so we'll be using the hashtag mental health and also hashtag mental health in ed. So I encourage you all to use that or go over to our ADCET Twitter to follow us there. Okay, I think that's about it. So I'm going to hand over to you, Brandon, and then I'll come back in with the Q&A at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darlene, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody for joining us. Wow, what a phenomenal turnout. So this is a hot topic, isn't it? Let me first of all say that I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands where I am today, here in South Brisbane, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Well, thank you for joining, and I will just give a quick apology for the movement of this webinar from last week to this. I appreciate you accommodating that. It's one webinar and it's one conversation, so quite clearly we're not going to be addressing, or I won't be addressing, every single scenario or situation. But it's a conversation that we absolutely need to have within our organisations. Today I'll be using the term teachers and educators, and that really covers lecturers, industry trainers, frankly anybody that actually delivers a course or a programme of study. I'll use that interchangeably, and of course all of the support services staff and many others in your organisations. So let's have a little look about what it is that we're going to try and cover today. The behaviours, and I'm going to specify one very particular group of students, but we're going to look at some behaviours, particularly around inquiry for study and enrolment. We'll also look at start of study and what those conversations can look like, both informal and formal. I'll touch on some of the abilities and limitations, and I'll make some observations. I'm always very keen to try and look at things from the student's perspective as much as we can, but it's important that we try to do that. And then we'll also have a look at consideration around how we manage some of the activities that frankly are challenging, and we're going to define what challenging is. And hopefully we'll tick off quite a few different things as we go. So the context for me, and I'm going to say this up front, and I'm going to say it again towards the end of this webinar. The context here, I want you to be very, very clear about. So the obvious statement is that across the tertiary sector, there are many students who will experience mental ill health at some time during their studies. Absolutely to be expected, absolutely predictable, simply a reflection of society and the age of the students that we have. And in the vast majority of those individuals, despite the very personal impacts on the individual, we hope that the vast majority of those students can access either student supports through our organisations, whatever they may be, and where possible, that individuals can access specific mental health service provision, whether that's through their GP, connecting or reconnecting with a mental health practitioner, and whatever treatment may follow after that. And it may well be the case that a number of students will require and will be able to easily enough have reasonable adjustments applied to their studies. So they're the vast majority. And of course, I recognise and acknowledge the many, many staff in our organisations who will experience mental ill health. But the context of this particular webinar is actually on a very small number of individuals. They are the very small number of students whose mental ill health is so disruptive to their thinking, to their thoughts, or their behaviours that they are unable to successfully engage and participate in their chosen programme of study. And the reason that I'm focusing on that very small number of people is because they can be the most challenging conversations and situations to manage for both teachers and also for support services staff. It's an interesting one, but I think it's worth mentioning that, of course, there's a number of reasons why people want to study, why they want to progress in enrolment. And I think it's certainly worth acknowledging that we sometimes see individuals who are clearly very unwell, and they have been advised, sometimes by mental health services and practitioners, why don't you go and enroll in a course? This will be good for you. This will give you structure. This will give you something to focus on. And I think it's just worth acknowledging that whilst the sentiment is all very well and good, it's done without any real consideration of the stresses and challenges that academic study and industry training actually requires of an individual or puts on an individual. And I think it's also worth acknowledging that earn or learn, if you wish to call it that, which pushes people who are clearly not well into either seeking employment or enrolling because there's an external force that requires them to do so. Those things can be problematic, and I'm sure that many of you have seen those situations. So when we talk about mental health, and I assume that you are all very, very familiar with this, but it's something that I like to cover with our educators, because this kind of session is something that I present to educators. We're talking about that state of well-being, where the individual can realize their own abilities and they can cope with the normal stresses of life and be productive and be fruitful. So in the context of this conversation and the context of the small number of individuals we're talking about, we are talking about that ability to cope with those normal stresses and be productive in their chosen studies. And I think for many of us who've been around for long enough, it's very, very clear that there has always been a number of students with mental health challenges. And probably typically over the longer term, you'll have seen those anxiety, depression, maybe bipolar. But in more recent years, we're seeing a lot more diagnoses of personality disorders, maybe PTSD and others. So we're definitely seeing more students presenting with a diagnosis. We're also seeing more students presenting with what we would see as symptoms of mental ill health who don't have a diagnosis. So from there, and I think this is really key, when we talk about the challenges and challenging behavior have become quite generic, broad terms. And I don't think we really define what they are. And that's part of the reason for having a conversation like this, because educators need particularly to have these conversations in a structured and positive way. So we're talking about managing those challenging situations where perhaps the behaviors are outside the norms or the typical scope of students experiencing mental ill health that we would commonly see in our student population. And for the purposes of today, I am absolutely assuming that we are applying reasonable adjustments, that it is a process that's already in place and being reviewed, and that the teaching practice is inclusive. Yet, despite those things, there would appear to still be an inability to meet the requirements or to conform to what we could call the expected behaviors, the participation that's required to be successful, and the engagement that's required. So that's what we're talking about by challenging. And there's many observations that we can actually make. And I'm just going to share a few of them because I do think this is really important, because it applies not just to educators, but to the support services staff, to our front counter customer services, to faculty administration staff. You may have had some of these experiences yourself, and this is not exhaustive, but it's certainly common within my organisation. At the inquiry stage, we tend to see an individual that makes repeated phone or email inquiries, many presentations at an admin counter or a customer service centre, and the inquiries don't quite fit. They can sometimes come across as demands. We sometimes see an extraordinary series of repetitive enrolment and withdrawal. We've sometimes seen a student enroll in the morning, by lunchtime they've withdrawn, in the afternoon they've enrolled again, and in the evening they've called the customer service centre to withdraw. That clearly should flag to us something is not well. We sometimes see very contradictory requests, and by that I mean a student that submitted multiple applications for study. But those applications are for civil engineering, hospitality, animal care, completely scattergun approach. And if very genuinely we have that person's details, I would encourage our customer service staff to actually have a look in our systems and see, has this student studied with us before? Has this person been with us before? Because in many instances, what we can see is actually a very long history of enrollment and withdrawal with virtually no completion. And when I say completion, I don't mean a course that's not been completed. Quite literally, units of study or even assessments have not been completed. So it does speak somewhat to an inability to tolerate uncertainty, that there's a certain level of distress. And clearly, something is not quite right. It actually presents us with an opportunity to have a very positive intervention conversation. Once we get past that enrollment stage, if that's progressed, sometimes at the very early stages of study, at start of study, particularly in the first term, these are just some examples of what we see and what our educators will tell us. We see somebody with very irregular or sporadic attendance. And when they do attend, they just don't seem to be in a position to participate. Sometimes when they attend and literally walk in halfway through a lecture or a class, there's a lack of awareness that the class has already commenced. And we see what I personally call a little bit of a performance in getting their belongings out and settling down into the class. So there's very little awareness sometimes. And I'm making some general statements, I know. Interestingly, though, despite some of those attendance issues, even where there's minimal attendance, we get a huge amount of communication via email. And it's something that I call the lengthy late night email, and you may have received these. This is when you open your email as a staff member in the morning and you have maybe an email that is quite literally pages and pages long from an individual, or 4, 5, 6 emails in the early hours of the night. And sometimes it's nothing actually to do with our organization or our course. And it's an outpouring of emotion. And we can imagine that there's an individual sat there at a keyboard or tapping away on their device, and all of that emotion is coming out. We sometimes see that very demanding behavior, particularly to teachers. Why won't you help me? You haven't covered this. You haven't taught this. Now, many years ago, I was a teacher. And it's a challenge to your integrity and your values. And it's very difficult if you're stood there in front of 30, 40 students who all know themselves that you're being challenged that you haven't taught a piece of content, yet you haven't seen the student for 3 weeks and they've not attended. And that's actually when you've been teaching this content. And we sometimes see those very heightened emotions. As I say, it's not exhaustive, but this is some of the feedback and the observation that we get from staff. Maybe you've seen some of this. And I think it's fair to say that we then ask the question, well, what's actually the function of this type of behavior? And really it's engaging in a way that it's the teacher that's not delivered this. It's the organization that hasn't done this. And in a way, the individual is almost protecting themselves because it's not them that's failing here. It's not them that's not being successful. It's actually everybody else. And it's challenging to manage that. So of course, it doesn't take long until we have to have a conversation. And my experience and the experience of the teachers that I talk to and I work with is that often there seems to be very little insight or recognition of the very genuine concerns that we're raising. Sometimes I've actually said, I'm really concerned here because you haven't been to any of these classes. You've not been to any of these Tuesday classes this semester. And I've had a student say to me, yes, I have. And you're sort of in a very strange position where you're like, but you haven't. What's not being recognized here? We sometimes have teachers who'll say, well, I've raised this concern with the student and they've just completely dismissed it. Why do you mention that? I've moved on, you need to move on. Or somebody who is actually completely failing in their studies, who says, oh, it's okay, I'll just continue. As if there's no concern there at all. It just doesn't seem to be important. And I think a number of staff, I know I've experienced this, when you've tried to communicate with a student who feels very angry or frustrated with the organisation, or maybe with an individual staff member. And you think, well, hang on, we haven't actually done anything wrong here. What's happening? What's happening in this space? I do like to have the conversation around abilities and limitations and the impression that we sometimes get, because we tend to see people who would appear to be quite independent in many ways. They either live independently or are essentially young adults who live independently, maybe in a family home. They can access services. They don't need support people to get around and take part in the community. They can complete enrollment processes. Yet it does appear that sometimes there is considerable frustration or a difficulty understanding what we would consider to be actually quite straightforward information. And I wonder how many of you have met with one of the students who has these challenges, yet is wonderfully articulate, is clearly very intelligent, and boy, are they brilliant at nailing you down with some facts. I've certainly had those experiences. So I do like to remind our educators, when we're trying to understand what's actually happening here, mental ill health is not an intellectual impairment. This is not somebody with an intellectual impairment. This is somebody who, because of their complex mental ill health, is having disruption to their thoughts and to their thinking and to their behaviors. And I like to be very honest when I describe this. I think the more complex and challenging mental ill health, and sometimes multiple mental ill health, is actually wickedly cruel. It really is a terrible, terrible thing for an individual to experience. So we find ourselves in these situations where normally we may have a conversation about why is it that a student does not seem to be able to focus on their studies. They don't seem to be able to maintain their attention. In these situations, we're not actually getting to that point. We're finding that the individual is actually unable to commence even the simplest of tasks and activities to even begin to engage in study, let alone getting to the point of maintaining. They're not getting started. And of course, particularly in my organization, the majority of our programs, you want people to engage with others. It's not about being a friend with everyone, but you need to be able to conform, for want of a better word, on some level with those people around you. So there's very, very significant limitations. That's what's being presented. Yeah, isn't it interesting that despite some of those limitations, we often see someone who has an incredible level of energy to pursue a complaint or a grievance. However, we may disagree with the basis of that complaint or grievance, sometimes multiple complaints and grievances. And it's only natural that we think to ourselves, hang on a minute, we've got all of this energy going into this, but we just don't seem to be able to get you to put anything into a simple activity to commence your studies. So it is challenging. It is challenging for teachers particularly, and for our support services. So I do remind our teachers in these situations, and it's as much for our own well-being. We can't address or right the wrongs in people's lives that are outside the scope of our business and delivering a program of study. We're also not here to endure any ongoing unacceptable behavior. We're really not. we're certainly not here in my organisation to diagnose mental health. And I say to our educators, you'll likely never know what's really going on. You can only work with what you know and what's presented to you in the environment that we are in. And sometimes it is perfectly understandable and quite natural based on our experience to fully expect an individual to fail. But make sure that you're giving them every opportunity. Revisit the adjustments if they're in place, or raise them with the individual. But it's okay, based on your teaching experience, to think this is not going to work. So part of those things that we need to do and we talk about really here are very straightforward. We must be that consistency. We must be that consistent, calm individual. And our teachers from my organisation are hugely invested in their students, as our support staff are, and across all of our student services. But you cannot become dragged into those side issues. You can't get caught up in that student storm. You've got to keep the messaging on track so that the student knows the conversations that they're having with you are about study. And I'm a great believer in addressing concerns sooner rather than later, because particularly in these instances, if it's somebody that's just not participating in a way that's acceptable, it's not going to magically go away, and it will continue. And as I've said, we're already assuming that we're applying reasonable adjustments. And if things aren't working, we're reviewing them. And very importantly for staff, our well-being, because these can be challenging. And it's important to maintain boundaries as a practitioner, both individually and importantly as a team. And I know that one of the counsellors in my organisation refers to this splitting behaviours, because we will sometimes see a student with huge challenges who will try to reach into one staff member. You're the only one that understands me. You're the only one that helps me. As a team, if you're a teaching team or a support team, you do just have to be aware of that behaviour. And as I say, I do advise when a student's crossed the line in any situation, whether it's mental health or any other, because people need to know where the line is and what's acceptable in your environment and your workplace. Now, interestingly, though, for all of these challenges, it's very difficult to understand what it's like for a student unless you've got that personal experience. So as best we can, if you think about a time when you have felt particularly aggrieved, when maybe you were ripped off or treated badly, a time when you felt really hard done by, one of those occasions that kept you awake at night, when those thoughts were ruminating, and you probably would have said to yourself or out loud, what's difficult about this? This is just wrong. Why don't people understand this? Why is it so difficult? And those emotions are very strong, very powerful, and they're very real. And of course, these are the emotions that the student is experiencing. Whether we think they're right, wrong in their grievances and their complaints, the way they're conducting themselves, their emotions are very real. And that actually just adds a whole other level of stress and anxiety onto the individual's existing symptoms of their mental ill health. So we can understand that a person may be just not in a position to see the reasoning, no matter how well we articulate that. And yet you've got someone who can see their peers progressing, going to employment, going to university, having personal relationships, getting a job. And yet for the individual, Why can't I do this? Why is everyone blocking this from happening for me? Because of course, they're not in a position to influence their mental ill health. It is disrupting their thoughts, their emotions, their behaviors. And I'll say it again, it's a horribly cruel experience for the individual. And it is physically and mentally exhausting. And it will cause, as I say, other levels of anxiety and confusion, and sometimes just absolute fear. Terrible situation to be in. And we do just have to remind ourselves of that when sometimes we're being confronted by someone who is challenging our values and integrity. It doesn't excuse it, but it helps have some understanding. And I think that's a really important message that we need to get across. So how do we manage these conversations? How do we do that? Well, the informal conversations, for me, it's simply being explicit and brief, what's required, and give people a time frame. Because frankly, for any student, if you don't give them a time frame, is it going to happen? Be explicit. You have to keep bringing that conversation back to the task at hand. I'm here to talk to you about this unit of study. That is what I can do for you. I encourage staff, don't over-explain things. As we all know, sometimes if we can see somebody who doesn't appear to have quite understood or processed what we've said, we feel obliged to re-explain. And it's actually a time to get comfortable with that silence. Give the individual the time to process what's been said, because if we over-explain, all we're doing is giving more words and more terminology to process, and it's not actually helpful. And I'm going to use a very real example from quite recently in my organization, when a student through email communication, and I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a moment, hugely emotional, demanding emails to a teacher. And I can tell you that teacher was bending over backwards to help that student. And in a reply, that teacher said, "I'm sorry this is causing you stress." What the student read in that statement was, "Oh, so you are causing my stress. You admit that you're causing my stress." Sometimes we've just got to be a little mindful of what we're saying. And I encourage you, you must keep copies of your notes and your communication. Very, very important. Now, because the email seems to be a way that a lot of individuals communicate, I will say very clearly to our educators, you actually don't have to respond to a rant. You don't have to respond to an outpouring of emotion. I can tell you of a student many years ago who was very angry about crime in the community here in Brisbane and would send me huge emails about crime statistics and opinions and your organization should do this. It was nothing to do with us. I didn't respond to those. We only really need to respond if there is something in there that is a threat or implied, and more often than not, it'll be about harm to that individual themselves rather than to a staff member. That needs to be progressed and actioned urgently, whether it goes to a counsellor or to your manager to reach out to that individual. And unless there is some other quite specific action or request that's being made, but we don't need to reply to somebody literally having an outpouring. We really don't. You do need to keep copies of that kind of communication though. And I also say to teachers, you don't actually have to justify the teaching and learning process. This is actually what we're here for. If somebody wants to challenge me or question me on why we're studying something or why is a piece of assessment like this, that's fine. But there are ways of going about it. And if I have to give some direction on how I would like that done, so be it. But I'm not going to get into a conversation to justify why we're teaching the program that we are. After all, this is what the individual has actually chosen to enroll into. So when it comes to having the meeting and we're moving into that more formal space, I'm often asked about this, having done it many times myself. How do you go about this? And I think most of you will be doing this already, but it's good to hear from someone else, just confirming the steps. I can tell you right now, I will not arrange a meeting about a student's progress or lack of progress or some other issue unless I am absolutely prepared. I will say to that faculty, I want the attendance records. I want the bang up to date picture of assessments, what's been done, what hasn't been done. I want any copies of grievances or complaints that the student has submitted. I want anything that the teacher has previously reported, because I want to put together a documented timeline. And I want to be absolutely clear that I'm being as fair as I can to that student. And if for any reason I don't feel comfortable meeting that student on my own, then I meet with a colleague. I don't need any reason whatsoever to validate why I want a colleague to attend. If I'm just not comfortable, that's good enough. And that's what I say to everybody else. And, you know, I do have a wry smile when I reach out to that student to arrange a time. I always have a copy of their timetable, because it's amazing when you're trying to pin someone down how unavailable they are, and they're never available till the last Thursday of the month. Well, guess what? I'm looking at your timetable. You're in class 3 days a week. You're available. Firm but fair is the way you need to go. And in these conversations, in these meetings, and there are different types of meetings, of course, you set the scene, you keep it brief, you keep it factual, but sometimes you've got to be prepared for some deflection and some deviation. And you have to be quite firm in bringing that conversation back to why the meeting is being called, because we're trying to get a positive outcome. And if you are prepared, as I would be, I can address any absolutely false or inaccurate statements. I need to, because this is the conversation we need to have. I'm trying to close things down that have been said before that are simply not the case. And whether I need to state what the expectations are, I'll do that. And the actions from these conversations need to be followed up as soon as possible. Now, sometimes we talk about these meetings because they're not the conversations that people want to have, because they're a bit of a test, they're a challenge, they can be difficult. And I'll say to my colleagues, well, prepare for the conversation so that you are being as fair as possible to the student, but also as fair as possible to yourself and what we're here for. So as a staff member, when you've had that conversation, and it might not be a particularly pleasant conversation, it might not go well, in the sense that the student might just say, I've heard enough of this, and they up and walk out. You must discharge your own stress from that. Debrief with the colleague or the manager. As I said earlier, you must step back from that student's storm. And even if that meeting doesn't go particularly well in terms of the outcome that you would have liked, give yourself some credit for actually managing the situation and for having the conversation and for dealing with it. And I always say some simple questions both before a conversation like that and afterwards. In the context of what we're doing, in the context of the course, have we applied any adjustments that were required, and was it reviewed? Was that whole consultation process done as it should have been? Have we provided this student with ample opportunity to be successful? After all, that's what we're here for. And is there anything that was not addressed? They're not easy conversations, but they're conversations we need to have. Now, I don't know about your organisation, but we're a very large organisation across Queensland, and we have a whole library of policies and procedures. Can I tell you, a lot of staff don't know where they are. And you have to remind people where to find things. So we remind our staff, you know, you've said to me you've got these concerns. Have you actually followed our process? Because if you haven't, essentially nothing has progressed, regardless of what concerns you have. And so we're very mindful that, well, people know about, well, we've got a behaviour management framework or a misconduct report. We've also got a student intervention plan, which is actually a really positive conversation that you can have with a student and document it so that you can raise your concerns with the student and simply say, in our experience, this is what a successful student looks like at this point in the program. This is where you are. How are we going to help you to get there? What is it that you're going to do now that can be different? And we'll give that advice and guidance. Because if you're not having those really honest conversations, you're not addressing the issue. Sometimes people are a bit fearful of those, but more often than not, they are the most useful tool that you have. And if that's your process, that's what you need to be doing. I even show people the documents. I know there's some misconduct procedures there, but it's the one on the right for me. It's the intervention plan. This is what I'm offering to you. And you're getting, hopefully, some participation in that. If not, well, that's something you need to document. When we talked earlier about the being in the student's shoes, as much as we can, I think it's just important to show this very brief slide that I don't need to talk to as such. And I'm not going to read through it, but you can see the clinical language here from the DSM about the range of mental disorders. All those coloured boxes on the right, you're not supposed to be able to read it. The print is far too small. The point of this is that as we get frustrated with somebody who is presenting us with these very challenging situations, just remind ourselves, it's one thing to get a relatively simple diagnosis of anxiety or depression. But once you get into the much more complex mental ill health, that takes many appointments over an extended period of time. And given everything we know about the mental ill health and the disruption to a person's thinking, thoughts, behaviours, I'll be blunt and say it's a bloody miracle that some people actually get a diagnosis at all, let alone then access an appropriate treatment plan or support, even if that individual has family and friends around them. It's a miracle it happens sometimes, and it's very understandable why sometimes it does not happen at all. So go back to the beginning. We're not talking about the huge number of students that are predicted to expect some mental health challenges. We're not spending our time today going through what all those reasonable adjustments might be. In communication with this very small number of students, reduce the number of people involved, because often they'll be reaching out to different people at the same time. It's not uncommon to find that whilst you're responding to an inquiry, 4, 5, 6 other people across the business are replying to the same person. It's not helpful. Close the communication down to one individual. And when we look to the future in these situations, it is highly likely that the student will either have to defer, withdraw, or is withdrawn. Maybe they'll be able to continue in some form of reduced study load. Sadly, sometimes not the case. Whatever the communication and the steps, records and notes you must maintain. And this is something that I was in two minds whether to talk to. I can tell you that in a very, very small number of instances where we have had a student enroll again and again and again with absolutely no successful outcome whatsoever, that we've intervened and put an indicator on that student's account so that we will not simply just progress yet another enrollment unless that student is prepared to engage with us and have a conversation about, let's do this differently. It's not an exclusion and it's not a block in the sense that they can never study again, far from it. I think we have an obligation as an organisation to actually intervene where there is a proven track record and we don't go down the same road again. I think we have that obligation to the student. I think in some of the most challenging situations, you'll always have all of those urban myths going around, and I'll only touch on a couple. You do have to remind colleagues and staff that people experiencing chronic mental ill health are far more likely to be the victims of crime, physical and financial crime. Some of the media headlines, as we know, are just truly horrendous. If you want to know what's behind violence in any shape or form in Australia, it's alcohol by a long, long way, far more than any other drug. And of course, as I'm sure some of you have been thinking, hang on a minute, these behaviours can occur in all people, not just people experiencing mental ill health. And you're dead right. Yes, they absolutely can. But for all the talk in recent years about what is mental health, what's mental ill health, I just don't feel that we're having the conversations that educators need. How do I manage this? What am I supposed to do here? Because it really, really does test you. And remember that as a teacher and an educator, there's only you in your class. Nobody else is seeing what you're experiencing. So in my organisation, we've taken a much bigger focus more recently, a much more structured focus on how do we support our staff. We're fortunate that we have an employee assistance programme. We're fortunate that we have done a whole series of professional development throughout the year and will continue to do so. We're making much bigger strides into ensuring that as many staff as possible, particularly teachers, have up-to-date mental health first aid. And we have a real encouraging focus on collegial support. Teachers and support staff need to talk to each other about these challenging and see how each other is managing it and be that support for each other. We're fortunate that we've also put out this year to over 5,000 staff a wellbeing and resilience program to every single staff member across Queensland called Mind Armour. It's nothing to do with students or managing students. It's about health and wellbeing and resilience as an individual. So I appreciate I've covered quite a bit there. We were never going to cover every situation, scenario. How could we possibly? But I think you'll find that if you have these conversations, your educators will be very, very receptive because they want to know what works. Some are doing it very well. Some are very concerned. What should I be saying? What should I be doing? I know we received a few comments and questions prior, so I'll briefly try and touch on those, Darlene, if that's okay.
Oh, yeah, there's also just one of the key questions was the intervention plans that you shared, or the picture of it. Is there a chance to be able to put that on, to share that anywhere, or people are just asking for a copy?
I'm happy to share that document with you. I'll share that through Darlene and Jane. Yep. It's an interesting one because I haven't mentioned it as yet, but if you don't feel that your policies and your procedures and your documentation is working, you can change it. I know that we've got lots of policies and procedures, and they're there to be reviewed. they've got to work for people operationally on the ground. I can tell you that that student intervention plan that we currently have, there's a few little things on there that I don't quite like. Guess what? We're going to review it and we'll put it out to the people who actually use it. Is this working for you? Does it need to have a little bit more clarity? And the same for the students. So happy to share that.
That's great. I was just thinking of another, me always thinking of the next topic that we could talk about. Some of the challenges that people were saying in the chat was around teachers not necessarily picking up the intervention plan or the communication plan. They're kind of being maybe a little bit scared of using it, or kind of utilising those kind of templates or that kind of support. And it might be something that we could delve into at another time, because it would be nice for teachers to kind of build their confidence in using those mechanisms to support students and themselves.
Absolutely. Look, absolutely. And I know I spoke to an educational manager only last week, and there was quite clearly some reluctance from the teachers to have that student intervention. It sounds, and I think it's probably historically, it's the telling off conversation. Actually, it should be taken very differently. This is a positive conversation to have, and the language you use is you're trying to help that student get across the line. If they're not going to participate, well, you know that in tertiary education, you have to extend that hand of support more than once.
Yeah. Definitely. There are a couple of questions in the chat as well. We might try to answer some of them on the actual web page. And for those who didn't see the chat, we do record this and we do put the slides up so you're able to access it afterwards. And we actually send out an email to everybody who registered, so you'll get the link directly. One of the questions that came is in regards to managing underreporting for mental health and intentional, like often there's a stigma around how can we, support, I suppose, people not feeling the stigma around, reporting what's happening for them in their mental health. Is there any suggestions you have for the sector?
Look, this is a toughie, isn't it? In terms of anecdotally, you don't have to go very far in my organisation for everyone to say, oh, we're definitely seeing more mental health challenges. We're definitely seeing more mental ill health challenges. How do we actually quantify? How do we actually get that together? And I think, frankly, that without breaking any privacy or any students' personal details, it is possible for faculties and teams to give some statistical data around the number of students that appear to be presenting with, let's say, just challenges to participate. When there is an incident, let's say, with a teacher, and I know it's got a bit of a behavioural focus here, but this is the difficult side. We have reporting under workplace health and safety for all staff. If you have felt in any way intimidated in your workplace, you feel uncomfortable in your workplace, that is actually a problem. In the context of teaching young people, there will be a range of behaviours, of course, for lots of different reasons. But I think it's possible. I know that we're getting a new system. I feel every 6 months we get a new system. I'm not quite sure what it is, but we're getting a new system about incident management as a whole across the organisation. But I believe there is an option in there where we'll be able to record whether it's a behavioural and potentially to do with mental health. But of course, that's not going to be disclosing anybody's personal details. But we've got to look at ways of capturing something out there to actually put some quantified data together, because boy, we all know we need it for dollars.
Yeah, no, definitely. We're actually working on a project, hopefully coming soon, about trying to utilise your data to support you to kind of have those conversations within your organisation, especially around yeah, like for mental health strategies and so forth. I think it's going to be really important. There are a lot of questions, and I'm looking at the time. We're probably not going to be able to answer, or not going to be able to ask and answer any of them really, but there is one here that's how to deal with the stresses created by students. For example, they enroll as full-time students and work full-time regardless of our suggestions that it's not possible. In such situations, they are stressed and blame educators for their own stress. I mean, it's probably what you're saying is having those open and honest conversations and continuing coming back to it. But is there any other suggestions you have?
Look, it's just the first thing is to actually have the conversation. And it's just a very honest, supportive, again, conversation. And for me, it's simply, look, you're telling me that you're not getting through this course. What is this challenge? If this is essentially because you are working full time, I can't manage your external life for you and your financial troubles and your hassles, etc. But you're actually making an investment here in your education and training. And it's really only for what, 6 months, 12 months, a couple of years. You are going to have to make a decision that's going to give you the best outcome. I can give you all of my advice and guidance, and I sound like a parent, but you know what? In my experience, you're not getting through this now. How's that going to change? Because you're juggling, you're spinning too many plates at once. And, you know, I might have to have that conversation several times with the individual.
Yeah. No, well said. Well, thank you so much, Brandon. There's been some fantastic comments coming in as how useful and practical this presentation is. We will be sending out a survey. I think Jane will put the survey link into the chat as well. We really encourage you to fill that in. Our funding is never ongoing, so to help us get more funding and support to prove our worth, we really encourage you to provide feedback on this session. We also a plug this Thursday, we have another webinar, which is called Sharing Stories and Ideas for Change with the Disability Royal Commission. We encourage people to sign up to that. The Royal Commission is looking at the issue around low expectations often that are put on people with disabilities around tertiary education. And it'd be really great to have that conversation. You know, is there less expectations on people with disability in tertiary education, and how through the lens of the Royal Commission that we can have and improve things for people with disability in accessing further education. So I think it'll be a fairly powerful session. Encourage you all to sign up. And as we said, we will be sending out a link with our recording. Brandon might kind of be able to answer some of your questions on that page as well. And yeah, thank you. And also sign up to the ADCET newsletter if you want to hear about more of the presentations that we do. So Brandon, we'll share the chat with you because it's been absolutely amazing. People have really commented about how wonderful and great and practical this presentation was. Your wisdom and passion always comes through in these presentations and inspires us to continue to keep work and to do presentations such as this. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
Yeah, and I hope your week goes well as you return to work. All right, take care everybody and have a good week.